She had taken the ferry from Portland on a Tuesday morning to ask a man she'd never met a single question. The dock at Harrow Point was empty when she arrived. The fishing boats were already out. The man she was looking for wasn't at the harbor. He was behind his workshop, splitting cedar with an axe, and he didn't stop when he heard her shoes on the gravel path. She introduced herself. He set the axe down, not in a hurry, and looked at her the way someone looks at weather they've been expecting. She told him why she was there. He said 5 words. She had driven 40 minutes from the ferry terminal with a prepared argument, a folder of documents, and a very clear sense of what she was going to say. The 5 words made all of it beside the point, and she didn't know what to do with that. So she stood in the gravel behind a cedar workshop on a Tuesday in November and said nothing. Nate Calloway had come to Harrow Point in the spring of 2021, with a 6-year-old asleep across the back seat and enough tools to fill half a shipping container. He hadn't told anyone he was leaving Portland. There was no one left who would have asked questions. The workshop had belonged to his wife's uncle, a man named Bernard who had built custom boats for 30 years, and died in February without leaving a will, which had created a legal situation that took 4 months to untangle before the property passed to his wife, who was no longer alive to receive it, and then to Nate, who drove up on a Wednesday in April with Penny asleep in the back and the tools he had been collecting since he was 19 years old. He fixed the roof first, then the saltwater damage along the north wall of the workshop, then the dock platform, which had rotted through in 2 sections and required a week of careful work with pressure. Treated lumber he sourced from a yard 40 minutes south. He did it alone. Penny helped where she could, handing him nails, sitting on an overturned crate with a book, asking questions he answered, fully and without simplifying. The town noticed him the way small coastal towns notice anyone new. Steadily, without comment, from a distance that slowly shortened. The harbor master, a compact man named Aldous Frey, had been the first. He had stopped by on Nate's 3rd day to inspect the dock permit, found the work already done, and looked at it for a long time before saying anything. "You've done this before," Aldous said. "Some," Nate said. That was the extent of it. Aldous came by the following week with coffee in a thermos and 2 cups, and they stood at the end of the dock watching the morning light flatten across the channel. He came back the week after. By June it had become a Tuesday habit neither of them had named. Aldous had lived in Harrow Point for 62 of his 71 years. He knew the history of every structure on the waterfront, who had built what, which families had sold when things got hard, which ones had held on past reason. He noticed early on that Nate never talked about what he'd done before. He didn't say back in Portland or when I was working for or at my old firm. He answered direct questions directly and didn't fill silences with biography. Aldous recognized the pattern. He had done something like it himself, once, after his son died, and the version of himself that had existed before that Tuesday 2009 felt like someone he'd read about rather than been. Bryn Alderman came to Harrow Point once a month, on Saturdays when she could manage it. She drove up from Portland in her company's leased Volvo, stayed one night with her father in the gray house on the bluff above the harbor, helped him with whatever had accumulated, and drove back on Sunday before noon. She was 39 years old and ran a mid-sized property development company that her father had started 26 years earlier. She managed it with the efficiency of someone who had been watching how it was done since she was 13. Sitting at the kitchen table while her father talked through Gales on the phone after dinner, absorbing the language of it before she understood the substance. She had seen the light in the workshop before she had any reason to know who was there. Second visit, after the new tenant arrived, standing at her father's kitchen window with her coffee, watching the glow of it across the harbor at 6 in the morning. Her father mentioned the name once, briefly. Then in late October, sitting on the porch after dinner, Aldous said something she half heard over the sound of the channel. She asked him to repeat it. He said it again, and she let it go without fully processing it, went to bed and lay awake for an hour turning it over. In the morning she drove down to the waterfront. She had a real reason. Or something that could hold the shape of one. The development company owned a parcel of land on Harrow Point, a strip of waterfront she had acquired 2 years earlier as part of a larger coastal portfolio. 3 parcels bought together at a price that made the individual transactions difficult to separate. The strip sat at the edge of the harbor adjacent to the workshop property. There were questions about the shared drainage easement along the seawall, access for maintenance. Who was responsible for what when the structure between them eventually needed work? These were genuine questions. She was a developer. It made operational sense to address them in person. That was what she told herself. Nate was at the workbench when she came through the open workshop door, a hull frame in progress, cedar ribs spaced along a central spine with the precision of someone working from memory rather than consulting the plans pinned to the wall above him. He looked up, assessed her without expression, and set down the tool in his hand. He went to a flat drawer under the bench and came back with a folded survey map. Spread it on a cleared section of the bench, pointed to the drainage line without preamble. The easement follows this contour, he said, tracing the line. Original filing, 1991. Referenced in the 2003 transfer and the 2019 consolidation. The maintenance responsibility splits here. He tapped a point on the map. Everything seaward of that mark is on your company's side. Bryn looked at the map. Then she looked at him. You pulled the title chain on this. I looked it up. That's not a basic county search. That's 3 recorded instruments and an easement reference. He folded the map back along its original creases. Didn't say anything. You've done this kind of research before, she said. Some things you don't forget. Her phone buzzed on the bench between them, her company's CFO calling from Portland. She picked up. I'm in Harrow Point, she said. Can I call you back? A brief pause. Of course. Something in the voice had adjusted slightly, a small flattening she didn't notice. Whenever you're ready. She hung up. Across the bench, Nate was rolling the map back into its tube. He handed her a hand-drawn copy he'd made on graph paper, the easement line marked, the maintenance boundary noted with a small arrow, the relevant instrument numbers listed in a column on the right. She took it, she read it. It was more than she'd needed, and more than she'd asked for. He had done it without being asked. Which meant he'd done it before she arrived, which meant he'd been thinking about it. She was still looking at the paper when he said, without looking at her, while returning the map tube to its shelf, Your father wasn't wrong about what I needed. He was wrong about how to say it. He picked up the tool he'd set down and went back to the hull frame. The workshops smelled like cedar shavings and salt air. Bryn stood at the bench with the graph paper in her hands, and the harbor gray and flat through the open door, and she turned the sentence over in her mind and couldn't find the edge of it. Couldn't find where to pull. She drove back to her father's house with the graph paper on the passenger seat, and a feeling she didn't try to name. The problem with Harrow Point Holdings had started 18 months before, though Bryn hadn't known to call it a problem until March. The company's second-largest investor, a man named Prescott Ware, had brought in a consultant that spring to evaluate the coastal portfolio. The consultant's report had recommended consolidating the Harrow Point Strip with 2 adjacent parcels to create a single waterfront development package suitable for a hospitality group Ware had a relationship with. The recommendation had been presented at the April board meeting as a routine optimization. Bryn had not said yes. She had said she needed to review the full analysis. After the room cleared, her company's chief financial officer, a woman named Gretchen Lowe who had been with the company since Aldous' second year, appeared at her office door. There's a section of the original partnership agreement you should read again, she said. The one your father drafted in 1998. Ah, I know what's in it. Gretchen looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who has been waiting to say something for a long time. Read it again, she said, and left. Bryn spent 2 evenings that week with the 1998 agreement. The language around the coastal properties was specifics, in a way she hadn't examined closely enough. She was not entirely sure what it meant. She was not entirely sure. Prescott Ware didn't know exactly what it meant. She went back to the workshop on a Friday. She told herself she had a follow-up question about the drainage easement, which was not untrue, but was also not the primary reason. Nate was replacing planking on a lobster boat someone had brought in for repairs. She walked down to the dock where it was moored, and he talked her through what he was doing. Matter-of-factly, the way someone explains things when they assume the other person can handle the information. He didn't make anything simpler for her. She found that she appreciated this in a way she would have found difficult to articulate. At some point she asked about the workshop, about how long he'd been building. He answered without stopping work, running his palm along a plank to check the fit. Since I was a kid, he said. My grandfather had a shop. I spent summers there. And after that? A pause, not long. Other things, he said, for a while. She didn't push it. They were quiet for a time. The channel moved past, green-gray in the November light. She asked about Penny without deciding to. The question came out while she was looking at a lobster buoy drifting past the dock. He didn't break his rhythm. She's smart enough that it worries me sometimes, he said. She reads things she finds on my shelf and asks questions I have to actually think about to answer. He paused. She's going to be fine. He said it the way someone states a conclusion they've arrived at through careful observation rather than hope. Bryn didn't respond. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't have been smaller than what he'd offered. They were walking back toward the workshop when the door to the harbor master's office opened at the far end of the dock, and a small figure came out at a fast walk, holding a paper bag by the handles. Penny Calloway was 7 years old and moved through the world with the focused attention of a child who had learned to read situations before deciding how to enter them. She saw Bryn from 20 feet away and stopped. Looked at her for a full 4 seconds, then continued to her father, held up the bag. Turkey and cheddar, she said. I made 2. Nate took 1/2. He glanced at Bryn with an expression that was, unless she was reading it wrong, an invitation. Bryn took the other half. Penny looked at the transaction with the expression of someone confirming a calculation. Then she turned and walked back to the harbor master's office, where Alchus had apparently been watching the whole thing through the window. Because, when Penny went inside, he was already turned away toward his desk, not watching at all. Later, in the Volvo with the engine off, Bryn sat looking at the workshop lights still on over the water. She had stayed longer than she'd meant to. The sandwich had been good. She didn't start the car for several minutes and couldn't have explained what she was waiting for. Her father called her into his study that evening. He was in the chair by the window, the one he'd had since before she could remember, and she sat on the edge of the footstool across from him, which put them at eye level. You've been to the workshop twice, he said. There are easement questions. He looked at her with the patience of someone waiting for an argument to find its own weakness. What did you say to him? She asked. That morning on the porch. What was the whole sentence? I said what I said. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the channel. I've been watching that man for 6 months, he said. You know what I've never heard him do? Ask for credit. He rebuilt that entire dock without saying once what he'd done before, that taught him how. He reads marine survey maps the way other people read the news. He had that workshop weatherproofed in 2 weeks using methods I've seen licensed contractors miss. He settled back in the chair. I left this company to you, not because you were ready, he said, but because you're the only person I trust to want it for the right reasons. Bryn remembered the meeting where he had officially stepped back. She had been 34. She had felt, at the time, that she understood what it meant. I recognized something in him, Aldous said simply. The look of a person who has made the harder choice and is living it. So why send me down there with a sentence you knew I'd take the wrong way? He smiled, not unkindly. Because you would have found a reason to stay away if I'd said it plainly. She didn't argue. He wasn't wrong. Back in her room, she picked up her phone. She had his number from the easement exchange. She typed, Are you around for coffee sometime this week? Deleted it. Typed, Coffee this week? Deleted that. Typed, Coffee Saturday? And sent it before she finished deciding. His reply came 11 minutes later. Harbor Cafe, 8 a.m. I'll be the one with cedar dust on my jacket. No question, no explanation requested, just the information. She set the phone on the nightstand and lay in the dark for a while, thinking about the fact that she had texted someone without knowing what she wanted from the conversation. She wasn't sure that had ever happened. Not like this. The board situation moved faster than she expected. Prescott Ware called an emergency partners meeting 2 weeks before the Saturday coffee, framing it as a time-sensitive opportunity with the hospitality group. The presentation was well prepared. The projections were conservative and reassuring. The offer valued the coastal portfolio at a number that was real and serious. Bryn did not say yes. She asked for 30 days to complete her own analysis. After the meeting, Gretchen appeared beside her in the elevator. The 1998 provision, she said, looking at the floor indicator, specifically the language about coastal asset disposition. Ware's counsel sent a memo last week arguing it's non-operative. I want you to read the memo and then read the provision yourself and tell me what you think. I've read the provision. Read it again, Gretchen said, and stepped off at the floor below. That evening, Bryn read both documents 3 times. The memo cited 2 precedents. The provision language was dense enough that she genuinely wasn't sure which reading was correct. She was not certain Prescott Ware's lawyers didn't know exactly which reading was correct. Saturday morning, Harbor Cafe was warm and 3/4 full when she arrived. Nate was already at a corner table by the window. He had ordered 2 coffees without knowing how she took it, and he had been right, and he didn't mention that. They talked for an hour without getting to the company. About Penny's current interest in coastal ecology. About Harrow Point in January when the summer visitors left, and the town reduced to the people who actually lived there. About Aldous' ongoing attempt to cure his own salmon, which had produced results ranging from inedible to alarming. Bryn found herself laughing. Both times surprised her. Then Nate asked, without build-up, "What keeps you awake about the business?" She had been asked some version of this before, in strategic planning sessions, in the one executive coaching engagement she'd tried and found useless, in investor calls where it was a setup for reassurance. She had an answer she could give to all of those contexts, calibrated and careful and true about almost nothing. She didn't give it. "Someone is trying to restructure what my father built," she said, "and calling it optimization." He didn't nod, didn't offer a frame. He picked up the coffee pot the server had left on the table and refilled her cup. That was it, and somehow it was enough. Enough that she kept talking for the next several minutes about what her father had actually built, what it had cost him, why the waterfront properties weren't investments in the ordinary sense, but the original proof that the company stood for something beyond return on square footage. She talked. Nate listened. Outside the window, a man walked past with a yellow dog on a short leash. The dog stopped to investigate a parking meter, and the man waited with total patience. On the sidewalk afterward, she stood in the cold while she looked for her keys. Gretchen knew something about the 1998 agreement she hadn't read closely enough, and Nate, who had never once explained himself, who had pulled a 30-year title chain before their first conversation, had listened to her. The way someone listens when they already know the landscape. She drove back to Portland with both of those things in the car with her and didn't turn the radio on. The second piece of information about Nate Calloway arrived in Prescott Ware's inbox on a Monday and contained the same absence as the first. No professional filings after 2020. No association memberships, no published material, no digital footprint consistent with someone who had simply been doing something else for a few years. The research firm Ware had used noted that the level of deliberate absence suggested either a significant professional failure or a significant professional withdrawal, and that in their experience, these were different in ways that mattered. Ware authorized a deeper pull. He also had his attorney draft a letter to the full partners group, arguing that the 1998 coastal provision was legally dormant, that Oregon statute established a fixed activation window, and a provision unreferenced in meeting records since 2003 had effectively lapsed. The letter cited 2 cases. He circulated it the day before Bryn was scheduled to review the provision with outside counsel. She read the letter. Then she read the provision. Then she sat at her desk for a long time. On a Friday evening, she drove to Harrow Point with no stated reason. She checked on Aldous, which was genuine. She stopped at the waterfront market on her way, which was winding down in the low November light. She was standing at a table of late-season apples when someone appeared beside her, small, calm, 7 years old. "Those are Gallus," Penny said. "They're okay. The Fujis are better." She pointed to the adjacent table. They moved together. Bryn bought a bag. Penny explained that apples stored better in a single layer, stem end up, in a cool room. Her father had shown her in September, along with the refrigerator chemistry, which Penny recounted with the precision of someone who had memorized the explanation rather than summarized it. "He explains a lot," Bryn said. Penny considered this. "He knows a lot," she said, the distinction carrying weight. Across the market, Nate had seen them. He stood 2 tables away holding a canvas tote, and he didn't come over. He stayed where he was, watching his daughter stand comfortably beside a woman she'd met twice, pointing at fruit. And he remained at that distance, until they looked up, And Penny waved him over with the casual authority of someone who has decided something is fine. That evening, after Penny was asleep, Nate made a phone call to a number with a Portland area code. It rang 3 times. "I figured you'd call," the man on the other end said. He asked about Harrow Point Holdings, about the 1998 partnership provision, about the specific legal argument Ware's attorney had constructed. He asked about a name. The man on the other end knew the provision and knew the name and spent 15 minutes thinking through the legal argument. "The provision doesn't lapse," he said finally. "The Oregon case Ware cited was overturned on appeal in 2018. The reversal didn't get much circulation. You'd have to know to go looking." Nate said nothing for a moment. "Are you going to tell her who you are?" the man asked. "Not yet," Nate said. On a Saturday morning he drove to Portland for the first time in 2 years. He parked 3 blocks from the Harrow Point Holdings office on Burnside and went in through the main entrance at 7:45. He left an envelope with the front desk. Inside, 3 handwritten pages, the 1998 provision broken down section by section. Ware's attorney's letter addressed point by point. The overturned Oregon case cited with its full appellate reference number. At the top, in his ordinary handwriting, the provision is operative. Ask Ware when he joined the partnership. No name, no signature. He drove back to Harrow Point. He did not call. Bryn read the envelope at her desk at 8:30. She read it twice. Then she sat back and looked out the window at the street below, the ordinary Saturday morning traffic. And she thought about the man she had met at a workshop door 3 weeks earlier, who had said 5 words she was still turning over. He was already gone. She didn't need to check to know it. She pulled Ware's partnership entry date from the company records that afternoon. He had joined in 2020, 14 months after. Aldous had quietly renewed the coastal provision during a routine annual filing. He hadn't noted it in the meeting minutes. It was a protective clause he'd hoped would never need to be used. Ware had joined knowing the provision existed. He had built the entire restructuring proposal around the assumption that Bryn would either miss it or be persuaded by his attorney's memo to doubt what she was reading. She went to his office at 4. She did not bring anything. "You knew about the 1998 provision when you joined," she said. "Bryn, the letter addresses this. The provision is legally dormant. It hasn't been referenced in. The Oregon case you cited was overturned in 2018. The reversal isn't widely published. You'd have to go looking for it." Something moved across his face. Brief. Gone. "You've been taking counsel from a man who repairs fishing boats," he said. "Is that the standard we're operating to now?" She looked at him for a moment. "We're operating to the standard of a document your own attorney misrepresented to this group," she said. She went directly to Gretchen's office. Gretchen was there, on the desk. The minutes from an internal leadership meeting from the spring of 2021, 8 months before Bryn had formally assumed full operational control. In the 3rd paragraph attributed to Prescott Ware with 2 co-signatures, a recommendation that the incoming CEO not be briefed on the coastal provision, as it would complicate the transition and was unlikely to be material. 2 partners had signed it. Bryn read it once. The room was very quiet. At 6:15, she got into her car and drove north without making a plan for it. The sky shifted from flat white to orange to dark. She didn't turn the radio on. When she came off the coast highway and turned down toward the harbor, the only lights were the dock lamps and the single light above the workshop door. He was on the dock steps, not waiting for anything in particular, just sitting in the way someone sits when the day has been long enough and the outside quiet matches the inside. She crossed the gravel. She didn't look for the gate. She stopped in front of him. "Who are you?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. The light above the workshop hummed faintly against the sound of the channel. "Someone who read a similar document 12 years ago," he said, "and didn't push hard enough on what didn't add up." He told her then. Not all of it, not in sequence, but enough. Torrance Capital. He had been director of structured finance, the position directly below the people who made final calls. A fund restructuring that had been presented to investors in terms that didn't match the mechanics underneath. He had seen the edges of it and hadn't pressed because he was 31 years old and had trusted that the framework above him was sound. The fund had collapsed 26 months after the restructuring closed. No criminal charges, but 2 pension funds had lost significant money, and the People who had relied on the investor disclosures had been given something that looked accurate and wasn't. His wife had been working at a firm that held a position in the fund. She had flagged concerns internally and been moved to a different division. She had been on the phone with her compliance attorney, driving home late on a Thursday, when the accident happened. He did not draw a direct line between those things. The line was there. "I left Portland," he said, "because I didn't want to keep being someone who understood what was happening and didn't do enough about it. I'd already been that person once. I didn't want Penny to grow up watching me be it twice." The harbor was dark beyond the dock lights. Bryn stood in the gravel and didn't say anything for a long time. There was nothing to control here, no outcome to steer toward, no position to take that would help anything. She sat down on the bottom step, not close, just there. Neither of them said anything for a while. The channel moved past in the dark, the same way it always did, without paying attention to any of it. The partners' meeting was called for a Thursday. Bryn presented the 2021 internal document. She read the relevant paragraph aloud, without commentary, and set it in the center of the table. The room was quiet for a long time. One of the two co-signers asked to speak with his attorney before continuing. The other said he needed to step out and didn't come back. The first submitted his withdrawal from the partnership by end of business. The second followed the next morning. That left 6 voting partners. The motion to decline the hospitality group acquisition was raised by the partnership's longest-tenured independent member, a woman named Frances Coble, who had been there since Aldous' 4th year, and who made decisions with the calm of someone who had outlasted several previous crises. The vote was 5-1, with Ware as the lone dissent. The independent audit was authorized before they adjourned. The auditors would have access to accounts Ware had managed with significant discretion for 4 years. That evening, Bryn called Aldous. She told him how the vote had gone. The document. Gretchen, the overturned case that had unraveled the whole argument. Aldous listened without interrupting. When she finished, there was a brief silence. "I knew Gretchen had been watching," he said. "She's been watching for a long time." "How long?" 8 years at least. A pause. "Are you all right?" "I think so. Come see me this weekend, and bring better coffee than the last time." She sat in the car for a few minutes after hanging up. Then she drove north and found herself turning down toward the harbor without having made a specific decision to do it. The workshop light was on. Through the window above the bench, she could see Nate at the far end, doing something with a set of clamps. Closer to the window, at a small table he had set up near the space heater, Penny sat with her homework and a glass of water, her chin resting in one hand with the expression of someone working through a problem that is almost but not quite solved. Bryn stood at the gate. Then the figure at the bench straightened and turned, the way someone turns when they've heard something they half expected, and Nate came to the workshop door and looked out at her across the gravel. He went back inside. A moment later, the door opened again, and he came out with a folding chair under his arm. He set it on the dock landing beside his own. He didn't say anything. He just sat back down. She walked up. She sat. 15 minutes later, the workshop door opened again. Penny came out with her homework folder and her water glass and settled cross-legged on the dock planks below them without explanation, as if this configuration had existed before tonight, and she was simply returning to her spot. The harbor was very dark. The channel lights reflected in long lines across the water. Somewhere out past the breakwater, a boat was running without showing itself, just the low sound of it and the running light moving east. Bryn sat on the dock in the cold night air and did not feel, for the first time in longer than she could measure, the particular weight of being responsible for what happened next. She was just a person sitting somewhere quiet, and that was enough. The audit ran for 4 weeks. When it concluded, the findings were referred to the Oregon Department of Justice. Ware's attorneys began the work of managing what came next. Bryn stopped reading about it closely after the first week. She had done what she could do. The rest was process. The company's first quarter, under the restructured partnership, closed with numbers she could be proud of. Not in the way she'd been proud before, which had been about defense, about keeping what existed from being taken. This was different. It felt like direction. She promoted Gretchen to a formal partnership stake in the company, which Gretchen accepted with the brevity of someone who had been unofficially performing the role for years and was simply glad to have the paperwork catch up. Aldous' health steadied through the winter. He walked the harbor road most mornings and started keeping notes on what he observed, the tides, the bird populations, the behavior of the boats, with a seriousness that suggested the project mattered to him in ways he hadn't explained. Penny spent Wednesday afternoons in the harbor master's office, where Aldous had charts of the Oregon coast going back to the 1970s. He taught her to read current tables. She taught him to identify the different species of seagrass along the harbor wall. Both of them were learning faster than they let on. Bryn came to Harrow Point more often, without much planning. Sometimes midweek. She and Nate didn't arrange their time with structure. She would arrive and he would be working on something, and she would watch or help or sit nearby while the hours went the way hours go when no one is accounting for them. On a Thursday morning in February, she came into the Portland office and found Gretchen already there, coffee made, a single document on Bryn's desk, a property transfer record. Nate Calloway had purchased the waterfront strip, the 3.8 acres that Harrow Point Holdings had been carrying in the coastal portfolio since the original acquisition. He had offered the appraised value. He hadn't asked for a negotiation. The transfer had completed the previous afternoon. Bryn looked at the document. She looked up at Gretchen. Gretchen picked up her coffee and walked back to her office without comment. On a Saturday in early March, the light was still gold over the channel when Bryn drove down to the harbor. She parked at the waterfront and walked out along the seawall to the boundary line. The edge where the company's former parcel met the workshop property, which was now the same property, the boundary that had been the reason for all of it, and was now just a line on a survey that didn't need negotiating anymore. Nate was there. She didn't know if he'd heard her car or if he'd already been standing at that spot. He was looking out at the channel, the evening light coming in at a low angle and making everything look like something worth keeping. She stood beside him. Neither of them said anything. Behind them, at a comfortable distance, Penny came out of the workshop with a book under her arm and headed toward the harbor master's office at the easy pace of a child going somewhere. She was always welcome. She did not look back. Further along the dock, Aldous appeared in his office doorway. He looked out at the two people standing at the seawall. He didn't come down. He just stood there, in the way of someone watching something finish arriving. The light went lower. The channel held its color for a while, the way it did on evenings, when the wind dropped and the water went still. Then the color softened. Then it was just the harbor in the early dark, ordinary and complete, the dock lamps coming on one at a time. No one said anything that needed to be said. There was no moment that required a name. There were just two people standing at a seawall they no longer had any reason to argue over, in the last of a Saturday's light, with the channel moving past below them and nowhere else they were expected to be. Neither of them had been looking for anything. That was the only reason it had found them.